series of events called The Power of the Vote: Registration, Education, and Awareness. And I'm sure you can all imagine, with the impact of the pandemic, as well as the racial unreckoning that is going on in this country, it is time for us to have some honest conversations about everything, just about everything. So it is my pleasure to, before we get started, let me talk about just a little bit about this collaboration with the Intercultural Resource Center. Intercultural Resource Center is a center at Rutgers University in collaboration with SPAA. This day is the day of dialogue. So earlier today, students have been participating in different discussions, opportunities to share about what this election means to them, from undocumented students to students who are undecided to vote. Later, after our presentation, you will hear from the director of the Intercultural Resource Center, Gary Santos-Doza. But at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Charles Menifield is the Dean for the School of Public Affairs and Administration. This is going into his 4th year. It is my pleasure to introduce my Dean. Charles.
Thank you, Director Joy. I appreciate that. I am honored to be able to introduce Dr. Lacy Davis to you today. Dr. Davis has a PhD, an EDD from St. John's Fisher College in Rochester, New York. He has an MPA from Rutgers University, Newark, right here at our school. He also has a Master's of Administrative Sciences from Fairleigh Dickinson University, and his BA degree is from Drew University. His experience is vast. And I'm going to go back to the beginning for some very specific reasons, because I think it's very important that we know that Dr. Davis is not only an academician who has high intellectual capacity, but he's also served in police departments. In fact, he spent a number of years from 1986 to 2006 with the East Orange Police Department, where he retired as a sergeant. He also was the executive director for the East Orange Police Athletic League for a number of years. After that, he served as an executive director for Family Support Organization of Middlesex County. He currently plays 3 roles. From 2006 to the present, he is the executive director of his own consulting firm, LLC, the Lacy Davis Consultants. He also serves as the executive director for the New Jersey Alliance of Family Support Organizations. And then lastly, he serves as the executive director for Family Support Organization of Union County. And he's been doing all of these things for a number of years. So with that said, I will introduce Dr. Lacy Davis, who will be serving as an adjunct for us in the spring semester. We're looking forward to having him become a part of the SPAA family. Dr. Davis is going to deliver the Ballot or the Bullet: Police Use of Force, Shooting of Unarmed Black Males. Dr. Davis. You're muted, Dr. Davis.
Oh, they've unmuted you. You guys muted me this time. Thank you. So can you hear me well? Excellent. Thank you. So if anything could go wrong, it's gone wrong. Technology's gone wrong, twisted sideways and all of that. We can bring up the slide deck. I could not get WebEx to let me do anything, actually. So my deck should come up. I'm just waiting on that. And so while I'm waiting for the deck to come up, let me just go into some of this presentation. And so for me, this is an interesting piece. Malcolm X in 1964 talked about the ballot or the bullet. And that's essentially what he was looking at. Are we working on the deck? Because I don't have access over there. There we go. So he was looking at the ballot or the bullet, and Malcolm said in 1964, while speaking in Detroit, Michigan, that the title speaks for itself. And I thought it was most appropriate, given the fact that at this particular time, we're looking at inordinate numbers of encounters between Black and brown and poor and marginalized communities with law enforcement. And particularly, I'm looking at Black males. And so most recently, having completed my research looking at a North Jersey Police Department and using a firearms simulator, we were looking to see if there was implicit bias or explicit bias in terms of police officers using force and shooting unarmed Black males. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. Excellent. So we have death in custody with Freddie Gray from Baltimore, Maryland, and the Black community mobilized around this and police practices and complaining justifiably about how Black males were being treated, particularly Freddie Gray in Baltimore being killed in the back of, or dying in custody in the back of a police van. And so certainly police officers initially were charged. 3 initially were found not guilty. And so Marilyn Mosby, the district attorney, dropped the charges on the remaining officers. And then we had the high-profile shooting of police officers shooting Botham James in Dallas, Texas. We see it in Stephon Clark in Sacramento, California, Philando Castile in St. Anthony, Minneapolis, as well as Black men. Most recently, it's happened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the last couple of days, Mr. Wallace. Next slide. And I'm just going to keep going as I say next slide. If we miss it, I'll just keep going through until we get where we need to catch up to me. And so communities, what we've seen in this country is communities have launched the Defund the Police movement or campaign, as some have said. We've also had courts. We had most recently Amy Coney Barrett, the most recently nominated and accepted Supreme Court justice, say that the courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. We have the Dred Scott decision by Justice Taney in 1856, who says a Black man has no rights that a white man was bound to uphold. And then most recently, we have police reform initiatives like reimagining police, civilian review boards, police trainings, that we're absolutely talking about de-escalation, mental health awareness, community policing, residency requirements, and more. Especially, and most definitely, people are asking for police officers of color. And bear with me as we try to get this screen right. Just go right into this. And so when we look at the ballot or the bullet, Malcolm talked about 10 points out of that speech, and I highlighted those 10 points. Friends and enemies. He identified enemies in the audience at that time. He talked about a Black nationalist philosophy, and he defined that as he went forward, particularly calling himself a Black nationalist freedom fighter. Talked about a unified philosophy, and that was a philosophy that regardless of our religions or differences, that you cannot hear me. Can you hear me out there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very, very well, because I'm getting texts and people are saying they can't hear. He talked about a philosophy in terms of unified philosophy, regardless of the religion, and not discussing the differences, but having a political, a social, and an economic philosophy of Black nationalism. He talked about political control in terms of politics, not having politicians just walk into our communities and do what they want to do in Black, brown, and poor communities. Additionally, talked about a new political age, and that's about not allowing others to control who you vote for, or sending people who look like you and look like us to decide how we should vote and then lead us astray. Another theme that was raised was Black communities are not mixed communities. And what he meant by that is that even when Black people move into communities, other people begin to move out. So when we look at cities like Newark, where we had white flight coming through the 60s and 70s, and I've been here in Newark all of my life. So Malcolm talked about that in terms of voting in the ballot or the bullet. Additionally, talked about Black political maturity, right? What does that mean? Knowing what role politics plays in our lives every day. We must know the politics of our communities, and each community is different. Political re-education programs in terms of opening our eyes, casting your ballot for someone of your community who has the good of your community at heart, not simply because you may be a one-issue person or one-issue candidate, but what's best for your community and the masses in your community. Economic philosophy of power in terms of owning, operating, and controlling the economies of our community. I was in a discussion last night at Morgan State University, and one of the speakers talked about drugs trades in urban communities being the economy, an underground economy. But there are more economies than that. There are businesses in our communities. There are people, there are jobs in our community that we need to control. And finally, economic control. Other communities don't allow people to just walk in and control their economies. And so they look at housing, education, jobs, businesses. And while he said, while pretending to integrate the social realities that people are controlling it. Next slide. So according to the Justice Department in these United States, over 62 in 2015, over 62.9 million residents aged 16 or older had one or more contacts with the police. And 25% of the people involved in the street stops did not believe that the police acted properly. And the Department of Justice data indicate that black males are 5 times more likely than their white counterparts to die at the hands of the police. Next slide. The problem is that high-profile shooting deaths of unarmed black males in the United States has led people to believe that police officers are biased when they use deadly force in shoot, don't shoot situations. Next slide. And so my purpose and significance of the study is that when police officers make shooting mistakes, as one chief put it, there are immediate consequences for public safety, as we're beginning to see in Philadelphia and other communities where people rebel. You know, as Dr. King says, that riots is actually the language of the unheard. And so in my study in 2019, the firearm simulator, we looked for implicit bias, and we found implicit bias when we measured reaction times and error rates in comparing armed black male suspects versus armed white female suspects, which was interesting. And so my theoretical framework was broken windows theory, which actually are theorists or criminologists that come out of Rutgers. Next slide. Kelling and Wilson, 1982. And so they looked at broken windows theory, which essentially holds that incivility and social disorder leads to crime. And so you have to attack the smaller crimes or the quality of life crimes so that the larger crimes do not occur. Next slide. Additionally, I mirrored that in my framework with standpoint theory by William Hegel in 1807. And he was looking at the slave-master relationship in terms of how groups acquire and use knowledge and power, and how the oppressed and the oppressor interact. But what he also said that was interesting is that it is the perspective of the oppressed that is much more accurate in terms of that relationship. Next slide. So when I set up and designed the study, we looked at several perspectives: the historical perspective of policing, the threat perception and explicit implicit bias, which is a study done by Carter out of looking at the Philadelphia Police Department, stop, question, and frisk, which we saw a lot of in New York City with NYPD, community policing, and demands for black police officers, which is often the demand. From a historical perspective, there's built intergroup tensions between the police and black people. Stop, question, and frisk goes back at least 20, 25 years. And what you see is that the idea around broken windows theory has been a part of policing patterns all across this country. And it has been to the detriment of people of color, particularly. Police practices in black communities are viewed through the lens of slave patrols in the South. So we know that in the South, they were actually slave catchers. And so that was the paradigm, that was the model. And I maintain that that model has not changed. And in fact, Scott says the Southern lynching in the United States in the early 1900s had police officers present who participated tacitly in these lynchings because they gave their approval. They didn't stop it. So from a historical perspective, we examined 3 hypotheses. The minority threat perception, place and spatial segregation, segregated communities. That's the next slide. Segregated communities that are targets of coercive control, and then community accountability. Police departments promoting the use of excessive force against minorities. Police powers to stop, question, and frisk a person are grounded in Terry versus the state of Ohio. And essentially what you will find and what we learned in the police academy is that you do what they call a Terry stop, which is a protective pat down to make sure that the person that the police officer is encountering does not have a weapon. Next slide. So in the threat perception, we were looking at explicit, implicit bias. And so in some of the early studies of simulator studies, we looked at video games. Then Corel was the leader in some of this, where they used college students to test the threat perception and shoot, don't shoot scenarios. And essentially they were showing images of black unarmed males. And then you decided whether to press a button to shoot the gun or not shoot. And the same thing with white images. And in there, they were looking for implicit and explicit bias. And so these early studies said that the college students or the participants were biased against black males, particularly that they shot them more frequently, armed or unarmed. However, there's criticism from not from from Friedel and James, who argued that unarmed black males would not be shot more frequently than unarmed white males, whether it was explicit or implicit. And what they talk about is this concept called undervigilance, or the Ferguson effect. And in the Ferguson effect, what that essentially has argued is that because of the shooting death of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, white police officers, particularly when they come in contact with a black suspect, they think about the consequences politically, and therefore they hesitate or they're pausing, thereby putting themselves in danger and actually not shooting black males as frequently. Obviously, I don't ascribe to that philosophy. While my study was not generalizable to the larger country, but specifically to this department in North Jersey, we saw some signs of that in some of the scenarios, but not generally. Stop, question, and frisk was Floyd versus the city of New York in 2013. There was a ruling, but in 2009, they stopped almost 600,000 people, of which 84% were Black and Latinx residents, even though they only represent 26 and 29% respectively in the community. So that was interesting. And then Kelly and Sosa analyzed the NYPD reforms using order maintenance, or as we say, broken window policing, to explain the drop in crime from the 1990s to 1998. From a community policing perspective, people started demanding more community policing and also demanding Black police officers. And what I will say essentially is that we know from some of the studies from McCrotty, from Nicholas Crotty and others, that until police departments' capacity reaches somewhere around 30% or more, that Black police officers don't believe that they can stand up and defend and advocate for the rights of Black people because they're in a system in which they feel isolated. And so until you reach that level of capacity, what Black police officers will do is go along to get along. Now, in terms of community policing, Williams, Close, and Kane argued that it's an operational philosophy that reduces community police conflict through problem-solving strategies with the community. Well, we know from the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman instance that that just wasn't the case. While that was co-production of policing, in that George Zimmerman was in a neighborhood watch, Trayvon Martin was still victimized by the same mentality and the same behavior of law enforcement. It was just extended to this co-production. Next slide. My methodology, I use a quantitative study using a TI Lab firearm simulator with a laser-modified P380 6-hour handgun and a laser-modified OC spray canister for less than lethal force, as we normally call it, pepper spray. I recruited officers for 2 weeks at this North Jersey department, and we did the study over 3 days. We used 4 high-fidelity videos with primary characters in the video who were a white female with a gun, a white male with a gun, a Black male with a gun, and a Black male who was unarmed. Hypothesis. And so the simulator recorded the reaction times and error rates. In terms of the demographics, I had 30 officers, next slide, who participated. We used a survey questionnaire and descriptive statistics to present the demographic data of the participants. They were aged between 24 and 62, 17 were Black, 4 white, 7 Latinx, Asian, and Black and white, Black-white, which is how one officer identified. My independent variables was the officer's race, age, years of service, and place of residence. And what I wanted to know was, does a police officer's race, age, years of service, or place of residence impact their decision to shoot, and the timing of that? That's the reaction time and error rate. So when we talk about error rate, we're talking about, did they shoot the right person? And of course, we use SPSX statistical analysis software to conduct parametric tests to understand the differences between and within the groups. And so, for example, when we say between and within, I wanted to know, was there a difference between the Latinx officer shooting, the white officer shooting, the Black officers, or the Asian officer? Was there a difference in the ages? We had broken them down into rookie, experienced, and veteran. Rookies was 0 to 5 years of experience. Veterans were 11 years or more, and experience were in between. Were there any differences in all of that? And so when I looked at that, the findings held that the officer's race, age, and years of service or place of residence did not influence the decision to shoot or not shoot black males. But statistical significance was found in reaction times to shooting an armed black male versus an armed white female. And that's implicit bias. For example, in the scenario where the black male was armed exiting as a passenger in the simulator, he was shot in 0.51 seconds. In the scenario where the white female was armed, holding a gun on her ex-husband while holding a baby, she pulled the gun and shot him. And even then, it still took police officers of every race about on average 7.79 seconds to shoot her. We did find undervigilance or the Ferguson effect when we compared the independent variables with black males versus the armed white males. So what do I mean by that? So with the armed white male who was stealing a bike and pulled a gun out of his back pocket on the police officers, he was shot in 0.25 seconds. So he was actually shot quicker than the black male, because one could argue or suggest from the study that they took more time or delayed shooting the black male. And there could be several reasons to explain it. But what I found most significant in the study was during 120 trials, which I observed independently, 27 police officers were killed across 3 scenarios. 27. And so some of them hesitated, which would then support undervigilance, but some of them just did not use good police tactics, which led to them being killed. And many of them were killed by the white female because they gave her deference. Even when she drew the gun, officers were trying to talk to her, and they were trying to talk her down. Now, because I was doing a quantitative study, I was not looking at or recording what they were saying before or after the shooting, but I did jot down their utterances, because one officer, for example, jumped up and ran out of the room trying to avoid being shot. I had never seen anything like that in my life. I was off to the side observing, and the officer took off. So for recommendations for improving upon this study, I recommended 2 significant points. There were others, but for brevity's sake here, I cut it down to 2. One is that future studies should use a mixed method design to understand motivation and rationale of police officers while the scenarios are unfolding. So what do you mean? So as I said, there were voluntary utterances. And sometimes there were officers who said, I would have laid hands on the suspect, meaning that they would have used physical force. And I don't know whether that would have been right or not right, given the design of this particular study, but that's something that should be considered. Also, the one person that did shoot the unarmed black male, while we expected several would, which is why it was a hypothesis that we were comparing the other 3 scenarios to, only one person shot the unarmed black male, and it was a black female who worked in a position for at least 10 years behind the desk, worked in plain clothes, and after the shooting, the officer said, the reason I fired at him was because there was a gun on the scene, the gun being mine, and because he was bigger than me, I felt that when he advanced toward me, he could overpower me and take my gun from me. Again, because shooting the unarmed black male was not the appropriate response, or would not have been the correct response in this particular study, it was listed as incorrect. But if we were using a mixed method approach, there are those in law enforcement that would maintain that that would be a valid argument for using deadly force, while the community, generally speaking, would say it's not a valid argument. The second recommendation is to compare police officers' firearm simulator responses to similar participant responses in the field using a body-worn camera. So what do you mean by that, Dr. Davis? So one of the concerns is maybe officers were killed in the study because they recognized that there was no consequence to an error in the simulator. Or maybe officers behaved a particular way because they knew that they were being observed. While it was me and the firearms manipulator, the instructor there manipulating the machine, maybe they were adjusting because we were present. And so what I'd be curious to know going forward is if we were able to match their body-worn camera scenarios to similar scenarios in the firearm simulator, because there are 700, would the officer's behavior be the same in the simulator as it is on the street? And if there were changes, why are those changes being made? Final thoughts. Next slide. how is this relevant to voting? Because the argument that's being made and arguments that are being put forth, whether we're talking about civilian review board, civilian oversight, defunding the police, reallocating the funds of the police budget, all of that requires a political solution. And while we believe that what's going on, whether it's crime and or Black men particularly being killed by the police, is a healthcare issue because their health is at stake, all of it requires you having elected officials with the political will, the desire, and in some instances, the mandate from the community to vote in this direction or to put these kinds of policies or laws in place. And so I say to you, vote your interest. Understand the political dynamics of your community, as Malcolm said in the ballot or the bullet. If you don't understand, like I heard a young person this week say, I think both candidates are liars and therefore I'm voting for no one. But all politics are local. And so you have down ballot candidates that are also going to vote on budgets and make policy decisions that impact our lives each and every day, all across the ticket. So we must understand the political dynamics of each individual community and how your voting or not voting impacts the community. You have to understand that if you want to control the police, you must control the people who control the police, and that's politicians and political bosses. And if you don't believe me, simply do the history. Yesterday, my conversation was around Camden being used and put forth as the example of defunding the police or disbanding the police. When in reality, when we listened to Camden residents yesterday and advocates and doctorates in the community, what they argued was that they didn't disband, they disbanded the Camden Police Department, but then made it a county police department, took 1/3 of the officers that were on the Camden Police Force and let them rehired them on the county police force, and the community never had a voice in deciding how that was going to go. In fact, some of the study and some of the information presented yesterday suggested that the mayor at the time of Camden actually sued the residents to stop them from being actively involved in how this department was going to be developed. So that requires something of all of us who have an interest, whether it's Camden, Newark, or wherever it is you live. You must organize, organize, organize. And I will tell you, as Kwame Ture, the late Stokely Carmichael, used to say at his last lecture that I saw at the Newark Public Library many years ago, he says that every Black person, particularly and poor people, should join an organization. And if you find an organization and it's weak, then your involvement should be to make it stronger. And if you can't make it stronger, then start your own. But you must organize. And final slide. The judge in the stop and frisk case that ruled against New York City Police Department said this: the idea of universal suspicion without individual evidence is what Americans find abhorrent and what Black men in America must constantly fight. It is pervasive in policing policies, stop and frisk, and neighborhood watch, regardless of the collateral damage done to the majority of innocents. It is like burning down a house to rid it of mice. Judge Shira Schindlin, July 15th, 2013. We can move to questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate that presentation. It's obviously very timely, as we just had a shooting in Philadelphia of a juvenile Black male wielding a knife. I'm going to take some liberties and ask the first question because, as I was watching the news this morning, I believe, they were showing some of that activity, and they showed the video. And, the evidence, according to the news, was the mother had already called the police and said, my son has some mental issues, please help us. We're trying to get him help. She called and asked for help. And by the time that they finally show up, the kid is going through, one of his emotional outbursts. He has a knife. So I've always been told, don't ever bring a knife to a gun battle. And my question to you is, police obviously go through training. So looking at, you saw that video, I'm sure.
I did.
Can you tell me, is there a training issue there? I mean, I've been told that police are trained to stop, but for me, to stop is to kill. I mean, um, he has a knife, you have a gun. Um, I know that there's some force that's needed, but I don't know. I mean, walk me through that. Should there be more training? I mean, was it necessary to shoot 15 times to stop him? I mean, that sort of thing.
I think a couple of things. One, it's a matter of, so certainly there's a knife at a gunfight, but the family was calling for help. And so the question becomes, how much training did the officers have around mental health first aid, which is a concern? Is the appropriate response to someone who may have a knife in their hand, but isn't necessarily attacking you with the knife, the appropriate response deadly force? 3, while officers were in retreat in different parts of the video, what is the downside to getting back in the police car, since he didn't seem to be going back at anyone other than police officers? And maybe the uniform was a trigger, I don't know. And waiting for the medical people to arrive. And 4, do we need to use that much force is the question. I'm a firearms instructor, so you are taught to use, as we call it, deadly force. But we're also taught to double tap. And a double tap means we're taking 2 shots. That's initial, and then make a decision from there. You're right. I think some 14 or 22 shots were fired. And the question is that necessary? And their policy is going to say something. I think that generally my gut feeling, based upon what we've seen in Philadelphia, is that the officers are going to be justified at the end of the day. But certainly it is the wrong response, a law enforcement response, when we have a mental health crisis. It's problematic.
Okay. I'm keeping my eye on the chat room. I don't see a question there as of yet. So I'm going to go to another question that I have, and I'll keep my eyes open. So I've done some research in this area, and I was curious some years ago to know, whether or not white police officers were actually shooting African Americans at a higher rate. And what we found when we did our research is that, Black people in general, Hispanics in general, they were all shot by all policemen at a higher rate, not just white policemen, but all policemen.
That's correct.
So, Mike, as we went through that study, we started asking different questions like, I wonder what the role of the police chief is. I wonder what the role of the mayors, because we know that, as you pointed out, these become political decisions.
That's right.
And if the citizens are complaining about crime, they're going to want action. So the mayor's going to be on the police chief to, hey, get this crime under control. And that's going to be communicated down to the captains and so forth. So I'm curious to know, given the unwritten codes that we have, the blue codes, et cetera, what sort of role does the police chief actually have in controlling the behavior of policemen on the street, like despite the policy?
Well, I mean, it's like asking us, what role do we play in controlling our children when they leave the house, right? I mean, it's a 50-50 piece, but there's a culture in law enforcement that they do have control over by and large, because the reality is that if you want to fall out of favor with your police chief, then of course you go rogue and you will be out of favor. But if in fact you adhere to the policy, and again, it depends on the agency. I'm speaking very, very, very general, because the small town department's got other kinds of issues. But I think that when folks ask me, well, do they have control over their officer? The court uses a standard of reasonableness. And when the court's using its standard, it says that you knew or you should have known. At the end of the day, you're responsible for your personnel. You're responsible for your staff. And so you're expected to have policies in place that have control over that behavior. Because let's remember that law enforcement and doctors are the only people and only profession where you decide whether a person lives or dies. And the mantra for the doctor is do no harm. The mantra for law enforcement says that it's protect and serve, but they don't seem to be protecting and serving everyone equally. And you are correct to cite in your study, because other studies have supported, that Black and white officers shoot Black people at a similar rate, right? It's not just Folks under the impression sometimes, and I think misconception, that if we get more black officers, somehow black people still won't get shot. And that isn't necessarily the case, depending upon the number of officers that are on that force and in that department.
Exactly. And also, the communities where they're serving. Black
Absolutely.
officers tend to be, deployed in, the Black community.
That's right.
We have a question in the chat room. It says, this is from Ronaldo Ortiz. Thank you, Ronaldo. Dr. Davis, would you speak to the myths and challenges for defunding the police in affluent versus poor communities?
Absolutely. So, that was a huge conversation last night. And first of all, I often ask, maybe it was somebody Caucasian in a suburban community that talked about defunding the police, and they meant zero out the budget and get rid of the police. Because if you live in somewhere where you don't need the police, it's easy to say get rid of the police. I live in a community where I got some cousins, Pookie, Peaches, and Ray Ray in them, and they hope you defund the police, and they hope you mean that there's no police on the street tonight, because it'll be mystery night every night in some communities across this country. Because you need it, as an African people, if you're going to remove law enforcement, which people have a right to do in terms of determining how they're having their self-determination and how they're going to be controlled in their community, but you got to replace it with something. Like, the downside to not having police at all is that the people who are most vulnerable and most subject to being taken advantage of by others in the community will have no protection against that. In a suburban community, you can say, we don't want the police, because you've got resources and you have the capacity and you have the phone numbers to get change done in your community. In fact, we don't even shoot at white suspects. Even when we've seen white suspects with guns, not that they don't kill white people, because they do. On average in the United States, they kill about 1,000 people a year, and white people definitely get killed by the police, but disproportionately black and brown people are killed relative to their numbers in the population. But we know you don't see black officers shooting unarmed white people. Black officers don't even think about shooting Susie, Kimmy, and Joey, talking about, I thought they had a weapon. In fact, if you look at Minneapolis, where the officer shot the white woman this past year, he shot her and they gave him 12 years in jail and paid her family $20 million. Same scenario, different outcome, because they won't play that game with us. So defunding the police doesn't even make sense to me. If you're talking about reallocating the funds towards social services, homelessness prevention, mental health awareness, drug treatment, all of those kinds of things, food insecurity issues, I think that makes very good sense. But if we're talking about zeroing out a budget and saying, starting tomorrow, we're going to go out into the streets and there'll be no police to protect the community. Okay. The challenge I put to the community is, are you going to protect the community?
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here that asks about Black police officers that play along to get along. What happens when the Black police officers that are off duty are shot or killed by other officers?
Well, we saw that in New York and NYPD. I can't think of my brother's. I want to say his last name was Pinnell. Shot on the train stop, working undercover, had on the right color, had the right signal, and he still got shot. And while he was laying on the ground, the officer shot him in the back a few times. No one punished for that. And so Black officers are just as much risk when they're off duty as any other Black person walking the street, on or off duty. What was another? We had another one shot at the George Washington Bridge. I can't think of his name. It's escaping me. But he was shot and severely injured, shot in the leg, and he had on his uniform and a hat. And the officer who shot him on the bridge said he didn't recognize Curley. There we go. He didn't recognize Curley as a police officer. So we're at risk, which is why I challenge Black officers all the time. Why are you going along to get along when you know that you're in jeopardy as well? You're not safe because you have a gun and badge. I've been stopped by a trooper in New Jersey and had my badge thrown out in the highway and my ID and called an a-hole. I've been stopped in a Newark community by an officer and held for 35, 40 minutes, questioning about where is your gun. I wouldn't dare think of reaching for a gun in a dark street at 11:30 at night in my car, and you kill me and say I reached for a gun. I told him I didn't have my gun. He says, why not? I said, because I just was running out to go help someone and running back. Now, I did have my gun, but I had put to the moment the officer pulled me over, I put my gun under the car seat because I knew that I was in danger down there by myself in the dark on a dark street.
Wow. There's another question here. That one was from Director Stroy, or Ronaldo has another question. Given the increasing level of social unrest and insistent level of community protests, do you foresee realistic structural changes within U.S. policing, or are we seeing another time phase of unrest?
So I think that when we look at policing in this country and the shifts, I think while we did have some shift after Rodney King, I think that was 92 in LA, where Rodney King was actually shot or beat by the police. That's one of the first big shifts after the 60s. We then see Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri around, I think, 2013, 2014. But we have not seen systemic change, I don't believe. The largest change I think that we saw was in the 60s, when all of a sudden in the 70s, I think 1970, you begin to see the first Black executives. So you got a Black mayor, Ken Gibson in Newark, who then picks a Black police director or police chief, Hubert Williams, who runs the police foundation down. And then you saw Charlie Knox get picked. We had Black representation, Kurt Schmoke in Baltimore, Gary, Indiana. So all of a sudden, you began to see the emergence of Black mayors, and they were picking Black police directors and moving them up the ranks. But what has happened is that we've not seen that kind of structural change in decades. And I don't anticipate seeing it unless there's the young people protesting on the streets. And while we're not advocates of violence and burning down communities, we are advocates of them raising noise on the streets and making noise and not letting people rest. Because it is the pressure from the streets that forces people in the suites to make change. Because law enforcement traditionally is protecting property, not people. And therefore, those people whose property is in harm's way, they want something to change, which is why we talk about your vote being important. Because if you want to control the police, you got to control the politicians who actually will who have the control over the police. I don't see the changes coming, not unless something significant occurs.
All right. I see no other questions. No, I just got another one. Ronaldo, dominant media is portraying an increase in crimes in major urban cities, and specifically, as in New York City, homicides. What is this due to, and are we seeing a return towards heightened levels of incarceration in its nuanced variants?
So I think what we're looking at is, while some might call it undervigilance, I think it's the cops pulling back. So my 20 years of experience, I know exactly what I've seen police officers do. And that is that when you protest against the police and you protest consistently and you begin to hit a nerve, what the police will say is that we will leave you to your own vices. We won't police your community. We will pull back and we will stand on the fringes and we'll wait till you've had enough to call us in. And this is this game that gets played at the expense of the poor people, Black people, brown people, even poor whites, right? Where folks that are calling for the people who want the police the most are the people who actually are being victimized by the police. So it's poor people and Black and brown people who are saying we want to be protected, and then the police come, and when they police outside of what they do in suburban communities, they then turn around and punish people by saying, since you're protesting and complaining, we're not going to accept that you have a constitutional right to complain. We're going to do you the Dred Scott way with Justice Taney in 1856, who says that a Black man has no rights which a white man is bound to uphold, and leave you in your own community to figure it out.
All right. Do you have any advice you can avail for our young Black men on how they should conduct themselves in this current climate? It's from Donna Bowers.
I would say first, be careful. Each and every day, look both ways before you cross the street. And I'm being facetious, but I truly mean it. Because what happens, unfortunately, I don't believe that every officer, every Black officer is your friend, and I don't believe that every white officer is your enemy. I believe that it's the culture of policing that has criminalized Black and brown people. And Black women particularly are beginning to be victimized at numbers that we are now able to measure and see, and it's significant. I think in terms of Black boys, what I would have said a few years ago was what we taught and what to do when stopped by the police. Know the difference between a war and a battle. The battle is the fight that you can afford to walk away from, run from, hide from, and live to fight another day. The war is when you risk it all and you may lose it all, up to and including your life. But what I think now, because even when people try to do that, police officers still engage and engage to the detriment of the public. What I suggest is that you engage or you disengage as much as possible with law enforcement, that you think twice before engaging them around some of the issues. For example, if you've got a mental health issue, absolutely don't call the police for it, period. Perhaps in our communities, we need to talk about, when we think about reimagining, that we think about there's a different number that you call completely for a mental health crisis that doesn't get connected to a 911 system, that doesn't get connected to the police department, but gets connected to volunteers in that community who have the skill, the training, the capacity, and the willingness to help the community through these processes. That's a concern. So that's where I now would tell young Black boys, I call the young man today. One is that we need you on the front lines. We actually need you to be fully engaged in this process. We need you voting. We need you as a block. We need you running for office. We need you owning your community. We need you engaged in the economies of your community. That things, I believe things are going to get worse before they get better, because I think some of us are falling asleep at the switch. I want to apologize to young people, particularly young Black men, for those in my generation and beyond who have not done right by them, who have not made sure that they were safe, who have not created a pathway and left them a legacy as other communities leave legacies for their children. We've not done that in a meaningful way, and it's showing up every day on our children.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. This is from Courtney. If during the simulation you found that all races hesitated shooting the Caucasian lady versus the Black man, what steps can the people in power take to ensure this difference is eliminated?
That's a great question. I don't think that difference is going to be eliminated because, you know, my grandmother was born 1901, died 1982, youngest of 10 children, and all her aunts and uncles were slaves. We're still relatively young in having escaped the oppressions, the physical oppressions of slavery, chattel slavery. And so I believe that it's baked into the education, it's baked into the institutions, it is baked into the American experience. So, for example, in the police academy, they would tell us, you're not Black, you're not Latino, you're not white, you're blue. Well, that makes sense when you tell a white guy that he's blue, because everybody that's making decisions and calling shots is white. So you don't have to remind him that he's white. But what you're really attempting to do is to convince Black and brown people that you're getting ready to give guns to, not to turn their guns on anybody but their own community. And so, as Dr. Frances Cress Welsing says, there's 9 people area activities that are institutions where we have to either reform them, get in them, understand them, destroy them, and then rebuild them so that they can be just and fair. And they're economics, education, entertainment, labor law, politics, religion, sex, and war. Pick any one of those and begin to do the work in those communities, because in each of them you will find either overt or implicit or tacit racism in the institutions, especially in the educational institutions. Just take this field, for example. In the criminal justice world, most of the experts are white men. Does that mean that Black men, Black women, brown women, white women, other folks are not expert in the field? Yes, they're experts, but they don't get access to the power structure and determining who has and who has not.
On that note, Dr. Davis, on behalf of the School of Public Affairs and Administration, as well as all of the people that joined us today, I thank you. I can tell you that we're getting good comments in the chat room. This is one says this is a fantastic response to the question. One says, well done, thanks. And we are very appreciative. Folks, this is a part of a series. We have several more webinars around the elections and other timely subjects. So please, I'm sure Director Stroy has sent you the advertisement, the flyers for those things. So please join us in the future. Dr. Davis, thank you again. I wish you much success and look forward to seeing you very soon in person.
Yes, sir, Dr. Menifield. Thank you. I thank you. Director Stroy, and I appreciate you working with us with these technology challenges. Thank you so much, and good luck on everything.
All right. You have a good evening.
All right.
Good night, everyone, and thank you for attending.